September 1944, and a single intelligence report lands on Eisenhower's desk at Allied headquarters in Europe, and the numbers inside are absolutely devastating for Germany. Their synthetic fuel production has completely collapsed from over 300,000 tons per month down to maybe 20,000 tons. And this is after months of relentless precision bombing campaigns that targeted every refinery and chemical plant across occupied Europe. The math is brutally simple because the German military needs at least 250,000 tons every single month just to keep their war machine running, and suddenly they don't have it. Eisenhower reads through the assessment with that calm, measured approach he's known for, the kind of composure that comes from years of understanding that modern warfare runs on petroleum just as much as it runs on courage and determination. The implications seem crystal clear to everyone in that room. Germany is running out of fuel. The war could actually be over by Christmas. But something keeps nagging at Eisenhower as he reviews the deployment plans for the upcoming autumn offensives, something that doesn't quite add up. The German army is still fighting, still launching counterattacks, still moving forces around with a speed that honestly shouldn't be possible for a military that's supposedly running on empty. Either the intelligence is completely wrong or the Germans are operating on pure desperation in ways that the Allied analysts simply can't predict or understand. Over in Luxembourg, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley receives the same intelligence reports at his 12th Army Group headquarters, and he's built his entire reputation on methodical planning and understanding the unglamorous truth that armies move on trucks and tanks move on fuel. The reports are telling him that Germany is finished, that the numbers prove it, that the bombing campaign actually worked. Yet somehow German units are still maneuvering across the battlefield, still defending their positions, still launching local attacks that require fuel and ammunition and coordination. Bradley sits down with his intelligence chief, Brigadier General Edwin Siebert, and they talk through what they're seeing. The conclusion seems pretty obvious to both of them. Germany must have hidden fuel reserves somewhere, stockpiles that reconnaissance flights haven't discovered yet. Or maybe the estimates of German fuel consumption are just too high. What neither man seriously considers is what the Germans are actually doing right now, which is cannibalizing their entire military infrastructure, stripping training units and rear areas of every resource, hoarding every single drop of fuel for one final desperate gamble. Through November, the American forces pushed toward the German border through endless mud and rain and determined resistance. And the fuel question remains this abstract thing, just another factor in planning documents, another reason to feel optimistic, but it's not yet a visible reality that anyone can see on the battlefield. German troops are still fighting from fortified positions. Their tanks are still appearing, though admittedly in smaller numbers. Their trucks are still moving supplies, though perhaps more slowly than before. The intelligence reports keep flowing into headquarters from every source imaginable. A captured German officer reveals that his unit hasn't received any fuel allocation for 3 entire weeks. Resistance fighters in occupied territories report seeing trains sitting completely idle on railway sidings because there's no fuel to move them. Reconnaissance photos show synthetic fuel plants in absolute ruins with their production halls collapsed under the weight of thousands of American bombs. Down at 3rd Army headquarters, Lieutenant General George Patton studies his maps with that characteristic intensity that everyone knows him for. His army raced across France back in August, consuming fuel at a rate that absolutely terrified the logistics officers. And now, ironically, it's American fuel shortages that are constraining his advance rather than German resistance. The supreme irony isn't lost on Patton at all. His tanks are sitting idle for lack of gasoline, while intelligence reports keep insisting that the Germans are facing the exact same crisis. Patton growls to his staff with that famous bluntness. If they're out of fuel, then why are they still shooting at us? It's actually a really fair question, and the answer lies in understanding the difference between strategic exhaustion and tactical capability, between a military that can't sustain long operations and one that can still concentrate forces for brief violent efforts when it really matters. The Germans have become absolute masters of this kind of warfare by necessity, carefully husbanding their remaining fuel for moments that count, accepting complete immobility everywhere else across their lines. December 16th, 1944, at exactly 5:30 in the morning, and the massive German artillery barrage that announces the Ardennes offensive shatters more than just the winter quiet along the thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. It completely shatters the comfortable assumption that Germany is finished, that fuel shortages have rendered them incapable of launching major operations. The first reports reaching Bradley's headquarters seem absolutely impossible to believe. A major German attack is coming across a front of nearly 80 miles. With how many divisions? The numbers keep growing as the morning progresses and more information comes in. 5 divisions, then 10 divisions, then 20 divisions, armor and infantry attacking in overwhelming force, breaking through American lines in multiple locations simultaneously. Eisenhower receives the news with that same calm he brings to every crisis, but his mind is racing through all the implications. This isn't just some local counterattack or spoiling attack. This is a real offensive, a massive coordinated operation requiring enormous amounts of fuel and ammunition and coordination at a scale that absolutely should not be possible for an army that's supposedly running on empty. The question forms immediately in his mind. Where on earth did they get the fuel? The answer comes together in pieces over the following days, assembled from prisoner interrogations and captured documents, and the grim evidence of what the German objectives actually are. The plan isn't just to break through American lines and cause disruption. The plan is to reach the Meuse River, drive all the way to Antwerp, split the Allied armies completely in half. And here's the critical part. The entire plan explicitly depends on capturing American fuel dumps along the way. At First Army headquarters in Spa, Belgium, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges is facing an immediate and terrifying crisis. The town sits near absolutely massive American fuel dumps, millions of gallons stored in jerry cans and barrels, enough fuel to keep the entire First Army mobile for weeks. The German spearheads are driving straight toward those dumps right now. The lead German formation, Kampfgruppe, has already reached Stavelot, just a few miles from Spa. Their commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, has been told explicitly and directly that his entire advance depends on capturing American fuel supplies. His tanks and half-tracks are carrying enough fuel for maybe 100 miles of combat operations if they're lucky. To reach the Meuse, to sustain this offensive for more than a few days, he absolutely needs those American dumps. American engineers are working frantically to evacuate or destroy the fuel stocks before the Germans can reach them. At the Stavelot dump alone, there are over 2 million gallons sitting vulnerable and exposed. Some of it gets evacuated in time, some gets destroyed, but in the absolute chaos of the breakthrough with German tanks already entering the town, thousands of gallons fall directly into German hands. Paper's men actually refuel their vehicles with American gasoline right there on the spot. The supreme irony of this entire offensive is made completely manifest in that moment. German tanks are running on American fuel, driving deeper into American lines, sustained by the very logistics network they're trying so desperately to destroy. But here's the thing, it isn't enough, and it was never going to be enough. Bradley receives updated intelligence assessments as the battle develops hour by hour, and captured German officers interrogated immediately are revealing the fuel situation with surprising candor. They've been told explicitly to capture fuel dumps along their route. Their units have fuel for maybe 3 days of combat operations, perhaps 4 days if they're extremely careful with it. After that, they're completely dependent on captured American stocks to keep moving. The realization hits Bradley with the force of a revelation. This isn't an offensive launched despite fuel shortages. This is an offensive launched because of fuel shortages. Germany has somehow scraped together enough fuel for one absolutely massive effort, gambling everything they have left on a breakthrough that will capture the resources needed to sustain itself. It's simultaneously brilliant and desperate, and ultimately completely doomed to failure. Eisenhower grasps all the implications immediately when Bradley briefs him on what they've learned. The Germans aren't actually stronger than intelligence had suggested. They're weaker, more desperate, backed into a corner. This offensive represents the concentration of their very last reserves, fuel and formations stripped from every other front across Europe, carefully hoarded for this single desperate throw of the dice. If it fails, they'll have absolutely nothing left to fight with. The question becomes whether the Allies can make it fail fast enough. Through the dense forests of the Ardennes, the evidence of Germany's fuel crisis becomes impossible to ignore or deny. American forces counterattacking into the German flanks are finding abandoned vehicles absolutely everywhere they look. Tanks with completely empty fuel tanks sitting exactly where they ran dry. Trucks pushed to the roadside out of fuel with their crews long gone. Half-tracks and armored cars scattered through the woods, immobile and useless. Patton's Third Army wheels north in a truly remarkable 90-degree turn to strike the southern flank of the German penetration, and they're encountering German units that simply can't maneuver, can't reposition, can't escape because they completely lack the fuel to move anywhere. His tankers are reporting the absolutely bizarre experience of finding German armor in well-prepared defensive positions, properly sighted and determined to fight, but unable to relocate when they get outflanked. They fight where they stand because they literally can't retreat. Patton tells his staff as the counteroffensive gains momentum that they're not really an army anymore. They're just a collection of isolated strong points that can't support each other. It sounds harsh, but it's completely accurate. The German offensive has created this huge bulge in the American lines, but that bulge is filled with units that have expended all their fuel just reaching their current positions. They can defend, they can die in place, but they can't maneuver, can't concentrate forces, can't respond to American counterattacks with anything except purely local resistance. By early January 1945, as American forces are compressing the bulge from both north and south, the full scale of Germany's fuel desperation has become absolutely undeniable to everyone. Prisoners are speaking openly about the fuel shortages without even being pressed. Captured documents are revealing allocation systems that provide units with just tiny fractions of what they actually need. The synthetic fuel plants bombed repeatedly through the summer and fall are producing almost literally nothing now. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7 Corps on the northern shoulder of the bulge, watches his forces advance past hundreds and hundreds of abandoned German vehicles. His intelligence officers start compiling actual counts of everything they're finding: tanks and trucks and half-tracks and artillery tractors, all abandoned purely for lack of fuel. The numbers grow into the thousands. At a major commanders' conference in late January, Eisenhower addresses his Army group and Army commanders with a completely new understanding of the strategic situation they're facing. The Ardennes offensive, as costly as it was in American casualties and lost ground, has actually achieved something that no Allied operation could have possibly managed on its own. It forced Germany to expend its very last fuel reserves in a failed gamble that went nowhere. Eisenhower uses a phrase that will define his entire assessment of the offensive. They shot their bolt, he says. They concentrated absolutely everything for one massive effort, and it wasn't nearly enough. Now they have nothing left to fight with. The intelligence reports are confirming it from every direction. German fuel production has dropped below 10,000 tons per month. The Wehrmacht needs 25 times that amount just for normal operations. The math is no longer some theoretical exercise in planning documents. It's visible in every single abandoned vehicle, every immobile division, every German unit that can't redeploy to meet new threats emerging across the front. Bradley's staff prepares detailed assessments for the upcoming spring offensives, and the fuel factor absolutely dominates every single calculation they make. German units won't be able to conduct any kind of mobile defense. They can't shift reserves quickly to threatened sectors. They can't launch counterattacks at any meaningful operational scale. The army that conquered most of Europe through speed and maneuver has now been anchored to static defensive positions by completely empty fuel tanks. Patton characteristically wants to exploit this situation immediately and aggressively. He tells anyone who will listen that if you give him the fuel, he'll be in Berlin in 10 days. It's obvious hyperbole in classic Patton style, but the underlying point is absolutely sound. American mobility now represents an overwhelming and decisive advantage. German forces can only fight where they currently happen to be standing. The spring offensives confirm everything that the Allied generals had realized about the situation. When American and British forces crossed the Rhine in March, German resistance, though often quite fierce at the local level, simply can't coordinate at any kind of operational level. Units are fighting in complete isolation, unable to support each other, unable to reposition to meet threats, unable to retreat in any kind of good order. Major General Maurice Rose, commanding the 3rd Armored Division in 1st Army's drive across Germany, reports an absolutely surreal experience to his superiors. His tanks are advancing dozens of miles on some days, encountering German units that fight briefly and then just collapse, unable to withdraw, unable to escape the encirclement. His tankers keep finding German vehicles abandoned in absolutely perfect working order, simply sitting there out of fuel. On March 30th, Rose is tragically killed by German fire near Paderborn, but his division continues the advance that perfectly exemplifies this new reality. American armor is moving freely across Germany, while German armor sits completely immobile, still dangerous when you encounter it directly, but unable to maneuver, unable to concentrate, unable to do anything except defend and die where it stands. The evidence keeps accumulating into an absolutely overwhelming picture from every front. Intelligence officers are compiling reports showing the same patterns everywhere. German vehicles abandoned in place. German units reporting zero fuel allocations. German commanders surrendering because their forces physically can't retreat even if they wanted to. The synthetic fuel plants are nothing but rubble now. The natural oil fields in Romania have been lost to the advancing Soviets. The entire transportation network has been shattered by endless bombing campaigns. Germany is fighting on literal fumes and pure desperation at this point. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower's staff prepares assessments of German capabilities that honestly read like military obituaries. The Wehrmacht can still fight defensively, and it can still inflict real casualties, but it can't maneuver, can't concentrate forces, can't do any of the things that made it the most formidable military force in Europe for 5 solid years. Lieutenant General Lucian Truscott, commanding Fifth Army in Italy, is reporting similar conditions on his front. German forces in northern Italy, cut off from fuel supplies, are becoming increasingly immobile with each passing week. Their defensive positions are still formidable, and their soldiers are still determined to fight, but they can't reposition when they get outflanked, can't launch counterattacks, can't escape encirclement when it happens. The fuel crisis has effectively reduced the entire German military to just a collection of static defenses, each one dangerous in isolation, but unable to support each other, unable to create any kind of coherent defensive front, unable to respond to Allied penetrations except with purely local resistance. By April, as American forces are driving deep into Germany from the west and south, while Soviet forces close in from the east, the fuel situation has become absolutely catastrophic beyond anything the earlier intelligence had even predicted. German units are literally immobile in the truest sense of the word. Tanks are sitting in defensive positions, not because it's tactically smart, but because they physically cannot move. Trucks are being abandoned on roads out of fuel, actually blocking the retreating columns behind them. Artillery pieces are being left in place because the tractors that normally move them have no fuel whatsoever. Bradley tours the front lines in early April and sees the evidence absolutely everywhere he looks. A German tank battalion, intact and well-equipped, has been captured without any significant resistance because the tanks simply couldn't move. A motorized infantry division has surrendered en masse because it couldn't retreat, and the soldiers saw absolutely no point in dying in place. An SS Panzer division, once considered the absolute elite of German armor, is found with its tanks dispersed throughout woods and villages, each one functioning as a static pillbox because there's no fuel available to concentrate them for any kind of coordinated action. Bradley tells his staff in a moment of clinical assessment that it's not really a military force anymore at all. It's more like a museum of military equipment scattered across the German countryside, just waiting to be collected by advancing Allied forces. The assessment sounds harsh, but it's completely accurate. The German army has been reduced to its individual component parts. Each piece is still potentially dangerous on its own, but they're unable to function as a coherent whole, unable to maneuver, unable to concentrate, unable to do anything except sit and wait for the inevitable end. Patton's Third Army races across southern Germany and into Czechoslovakia and Austria, covering distances in mere days that would have taken weeks against any kind of mobile enemy. His tankers are reporting the strange and surreal experience of advancing through enemy territory without encountering any organized resistance at all, finding instead just scattered German units that fight briefly, then surrender because they're unable to retreat, unable to regroup, simply waiting there for capture. At one point, Patton's forces advance over 50 miles in a single day, an achievement that would have been absolutely impossible against an enemy capable of conducting any kind of mobile defense. But the German forces in their path simply can't reposition to block them, can't concentrate to launch counterattacks, can't do anything except defend isolated positions that get quickly bypassed and left behind. The final weeks of the war in Europe become essentially a race between American and British and Soviet forces to occupy German territory, with German resistance becoming increasingly irrelevant to the actual outcome. The Wehrmacht still exists on paper, still has millions of men under arms, still possesses thousands of armored vehicles and artillery pieces, but it can't move them, can't concentrate them, can't employ them as any kind of coherent military force. Eisenhower, in his final report on the entire European campaign, devotes significant attention to the fuel crisis and its devastating impact on German capabilities. The bombing campaign against synthetic fuel production, he concludes, was perhaps the single most decisive factor in Germany's ultimate defeat. Not because it stopped them from fighting, but because it stopped them from maneuvering. A modern army without fuel, he writes in words that will be quoted for decades, is not an army at all, but rather just a collection of isolated strong points, each one capable of local defense, but completely incapable of mutual support, incapable of concentration, incapable of maneuver. The German army in the final months of the war was exactly this. Dangerous when encountered in isolation, but absolutely helpless as a whole. Bradley, in his own post-war reflections, focuses heavily on the Ardennes offensive as the crucial moment of revelation for Allied commanders. Before December 16th, the fuel crisis had been just an intelligence assessment, another factor in planning documents, another reason to feel optimistic. After the offensive collapsed, it became an observable reality, visible in every abandoned vehicle, every immobile division, every German unit that couldn't escape encirclement. They gambled absolutely everything on one offensive, Bradley writes, and when it failed they had nothing left at all. The fuel they had so carefully hoarded for the Ardennes was gone. The reserves they had stripped from every other front were destroyed or captured. After January 1945, they weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting because they literally couldn't retreat. Patton, characteristically, is much more blunt in his assessment of the situation. In a letter to his wife in late April as his forces pushed deep into Austria, he writes about the surreal nature of these final weeks of the war. The Germans are finished, he writes, not because we beat them in battle, though we certainly did that, but because they can't move anymore. Their tanks sit in fields like monuments to a dead army. Their trucks line the roads abandoned and useless. They're an army on foot trying to fight a mechanized war, and it's honestly just pathetic to watch. The statistics compiled after Germany's surrender and may confirm everything the Allied generals had observed with their own eyes. German fuel production in April 1945 was less than 5,000 tons, roughly 2% of what the Wehrmacht needed for anything resembling normal operations. Thousands of German armored vehicles were captured completely intact, simply abandoned for lack of fuel. Entire divisions surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they couldn't retreat and saw absolutely no point in dying in place for nothing. The Allied bombing campaign against synthetic fuel production, combined with the loss of Romanian oil fields to the Soviets, had achieved what no single battle could ever accomplish. It had completely immobilized the German military. The army that had conquered most of Europe through speed and maneuver had been reduced to static defense, unable to respond to Allied penetrations, unable to concentrate forces anywhere, unable to do anything except fight and die in isolated positions. In June 1945, at a major conference of Allied commanders reviewing the entire campaign, Eisenhower returns to this question of fuel and its decisive impact. Intelligence officers present all the data they've compiled. German fuel production by month, German fuel consumption rates, the growing gap between supply and demand. The charts show the collapse so clearly, the exact point in late summer 1944 when production dropped below sustainable levels, the final plunge in early 1945 when production essentially ceased altogether. We knew they were running out, Eisenhower says while studying the charts. The intelligence told us that clearly, but knowing something and actually seeing it unfold are completely different things. The Ardennes showed us they were desperate enough to gamble everything on capturing our fuel. The Spring showed us they had absolutely nothing left to fight with. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, adds important context to the assessment. The fuel crisis didn't just limit their mobility, he notes carefully. It shaped their entire strategy from top to bottom. The Ardennes offensive was literally designed around capturing fuel supplies. Their defensive positions in the final months were chosen based on what they could actually reach with available fuel rather than on what was tactically sound. They fought where they were because they couldn't fight anywhere else. The realization that Germany's fuel crisis had been even worse than intelligence originally suggested prompts serious discussions about whether the war could have ended sooner if Allied commanders had fully understood the scale of German immobility earlier. Could they have exploited it more aggressively? Could the Rhine crossings have happened earlier? Could the final offensives have moved even faster? Bradley remains skeptical of these what-if scenarios. Even knowing they couldn't maneuver, he argues, they could still fight and fight hard. Every position still had to be taken. Every strong point still had to be reduced with force. The fuel crisis made them predictable, made them unable to concentrate or counterattack, but it absolutely didn't make them harmless or easy to defeat. The casualty figures support his point completely. American forces suffered over 75,000 casualties in the Ardennes alone, fighting an enemy that was essentially immobile after the first week of the offensive. The Rhine crossings and subsequent advances, though rapid by any historical standard, still cost thousands of American lives against an enemy that couldn't even retreat properly. Patton predictably disagrees with this cautious assessment. If I had known in December what I knew by March, he insists to anyone who will listen, I could have ended this war by February. The fuel crisis made them completely helpless. We just didn't realize how helpless they actually were. It's an argument that will continue in post-war analyses and memoirs and historical debates for decades to come. But the core realization is shared by absolutely all the American commanders who fought through those final months. Germany's fuel crisis had been more severe, more crippling, and more decisive than anyone had understood until the very end. The Ardennes offensive, intended as Germany's last great blow against the Allies, had instead revealed their final fatal weakness to everyone. The fuel they had hoarded so carefully for the offensive was gone. The mobility they achieved briefly was completely unsustainable. The advance they made couldn't be supported logistically, and after the offensive collapsed, they had nothing left to continue fighting. American generals had spent months and months reading intelligence reports about German fuel shortages, treating it as just one factor among many in their operational planning. The Ardennes showed them definitively that it was the decisive factor, the constraint that shaped absolutely everything else, the weakness that would ultimately prove fatal to the German war effort. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the fuel crisis was so severe that thousands of German vehicles were captured intact, simply abandoned for lack of fuel. The Wehrmacht's final week saw entire units surrendering not because they were defeated in battle, but because they couldn't move, couldn't retreat, couldn't do anything except wait for capture. The American generals who had spent the war managing complex logistics, planning massive operations, and studying endless intelligence reports had learned a fundamental lesson about modern mechanized warfare. An army without fuel isn't really an army at all anymore. It's just a target sitting there waiting. And Germany, in the final months of the war, had learned that lesson in the harshest way imaginable.